Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining. I'm Dr. James Tibenderana, Malaria Consortium's Technical Director. On behalf of the Malaria Consortium, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this webinar titled Taking Seasonal Malaria Chemoprevention to New Geographies. In this webinar, we will hear from the malaria programs in Uganda and Mozambique about ongoing research in both countries, which explores whether SMC can be a viable strategy for the prevention of malaria outside the Sahel subregion. I will set the scene by describing how SMC has been scaled up in the Sahel. Dr. Jimmy Opigo will sort of give us an overview of a phase 1 study on SMC acceptability, feasibility, and impact in the Karamoja region in Uganda. This will be followed by a presentation by Dr. Baltazar Candrinho, who will give an overview of phase 2 design of SMC acceptability, feasibility, and impact in Nampula province in Mozambique. We shall then zoom out into the bigger picture, and Craig Bonnington will describe the implications in the Sahel on SMC outside the Sahel subregion. We will then have a question and answer session that will be moderated by Maria Rodriguez, Malaria Consortium's country director in Mozambique. Sorry, let's move on to the next slide. Before we start, I just need to make a few housekeeping announcements. After the presentations, we will have a question and answer session. So please put all your questions in the chat box as we go. We will collate them and put them into the panel later. We must also make you aware that this webinar is being recorded and will be shared publicly on Malaria Consortium's website and social media. Finally, if you would like to tweet about our topic today during the webinar or afterwards, you are free to do so. We would be pleased if you could use the hashtag #FutureOfSMC when tweeting. So just to really give an overview as to what SMC is and sort of the strategy that it entails. Seasonal malaria chemoprevention is defined as the intermittent administration of full treatment courses of an anti-malaria medicine during the malaria season to prevent malaria illness with the objective of maintaining therapeutic anti-malaria drug concentrations in the blood throughout the period of greatest malaria risk. The reference for that is WHO in 2012. WHO recommends that seasonal malaria chemoprevention with sulfadoxine pyrimethamine and amodiaquine, the combination has the acronym SPAQ, for the prevention of malaria in children 3 to 59 months, and that the areas prioritized are where malaria transmission and most clinical malaria cases occur during a short period of about 4 months, where the clinical attack rate of malaria is greater than 0.1 attacks per transmission season in the target age group, and where SPAQ remains efficacious with a greater than 90% efficacy. Because of concerns over parasite resistance to SP in East and Southern Africa, SMC has so far only been scaled up in the Sahel subregion of West and Central Africa. The intervention has been shown to be safe, feasible, and cost-effective. And in a publication in The Lancet in 2020, SMC at scale was effective in preventing morbidity and mortality from malaria. Serious adverse reactions were rarely reported. Coverage varied, with some areas consistently achieving high levels via door-to-door campaigns. Those findings should support efforts to ensure high levels of SMC coverage in West and Central Africa. And that was from a UNITAID-funded Access SMC program. The 2021 SMC rounds in the Sahel have just ended. Malaria Consortium estimates that the total number of children who received SMC this year will be well over 30 million. Malaria Consortium's SMC program supports SMC delivery to around 20 million children in Burkina Faso, Chad, Nigeria, and Togo. The majority of children in areas of seasonal malaria transmission in the Sahel are now being reached. There have been calls to explore if this proven intervention can be deployed in new geographies beyond the Sahel. This webinar presents SMC implementation studies in 2 areas of East and Southern Africa where malaria transmission is seasonal: Nampula province in Mozambique and Karamoja region in Uganda. And on the right, you have maps showing the 2 countries and the location of the study sites in dark green. In taking SMC to new geographies, there are a number of questions that have been in our minds. In the context of high resistance, how efficacious is SPAQ in clearing existing infections and preventing new infections? How can SMC be adapted to the local context? Is the intervention acceptable and feasible in the local settings? How effective is SMC in terms of preventing malaria in children during the high transmission season? And how does implementing SMC affect SPAQ resistance? What alternative drug regimens could be used? And these are questions we have used in engaging the national malaria control programs and in the design of the studies that we are going to listen to. I would now like to move on to the next presentation. That will be given by Dr. Jimmy Opigo, Assistant Commissioner in the Ministry, who has provided oversight and leadership in this piece of work. Dr. Opigo.
Aqui hoje não vai prestar isso que vai acontecer. Não tem nada. Não tem carga de computador.
Good afternoon, good morning, everybody, depending on where you could be. We are happy to share with you this presentation. We are going to speak about how Uganda has decided to deploy and adopt and study SMC as one of the options for defeating malaria. As you are well aware, in the past years, it has become very apparent that we need to accelerate malaria reduction. It has also become evident that we need to adopt new interventions. Chemoprevention has become key. Chemoprevention using different strategies, SMC, IPTI, PT school, MDA, has been now heavily considered as one of the options for reducing malaria. In the past few years, we assessed our country and then we decided to roll out a new strategic plan. And in the strategic plan, we realized that in keeping with stratification and in keeping with moving away from one size fits all, some of our regions in our country could benefit from SMC. We chose, for example, the Karamoja region. And I would like to explain why Karamoja. Now, Karamoja consistently has had a very high malaria prevalence. But Karamoja also is very unique. High prevalence to the extent in the most recent malaria indicator survey of 34%. Meanwhile, the national average is 9%. There are many places as low as 1%. And in keeping with the need for stratification, it became evident that this area needed to be approached in its own unique way, according to its merit. We quickly assessed this area further as to why it is remaining very high. It is a nomadic area. There are socio-cultural issues related, high levels of poverty, housing. These are all barriers to use of conventional and standard malaria interventions. For example, we realized that mosquito nets use is very low and even to a big extent inappropriate because people live in houses they call manyatas, very small, smaller than a mosquito net. And most of them even stay out to play guard to the animals. And therefore, chemoprevention could be very key for this place. Next slide. The slide is not moving from my side. Could it be moved?
Jimmy, they're on your screen, on your slides, so you can just press next.
I'm trying to flip them through, but it's not moving. I stop and then you share from your side?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Next slide. So how have we designed the SMC implementation in Uganda? We opted for 5 cycles of monthly administration of SPACO for 3 months to 59 months old children. As you very well know, in the Sahel at the moment, we do 4 cycles. We looked at we looked at the rain patterns in this region, and we saw that the rain actually lasts 5 months, not 4 months. And we spoke with WHO, and we were guided. There is no magic about 4 months. We just have to cover the entire transmission cycle. We opted also to have the distribution done by our community health workers. We call village health teams, moving door to door, with the first dose being directly observed. You also know there are various options. Either people gather in one place and you give the medicine from there, or you go home to home for all doses, but we gave the first dose directly observed, then the rest of the medicine was left with the home, and then supervision and follow-up was done. But because we're implementing within COVID, we made sure the community health workers and all participants were well trained to secure them and also secure homes from them against COVID, and they were well protected, as you can see in the pictures. We made sure there is proper community engagement. The local leaders were sensitized, and we achieved all the support which is needed. And this activity has been jointly managed and supervised by the Malaria Control Program, Malaria Consortium, the district leadership. And we went ahead and also strengthened bed net use in this area. Next slide. So what do we want really to learn out of this? First, we wanted to see whether actually implementation of SMC is feasible in this context. Is it, what is the level of acceptability? And will it help deliver impact? The slides back, please. Okay. We also wanted to gather a lot of information on delivery and to see what adaptations and we can make relevant to the local context here based on the experiences from West Africa. Our intention also is eventually to move from an implementation study mode and turn this into a program. So we designed straight away with the sustainability and easy transition to a program mode. Next slide. So this is the study area. As you can see, it is northwestern part of the country, only Karamoja. It is a semi-arid region. And it is in line with our stratification maps. Next slide. So we made the following adaptations. They are normally option of just using existing administrative data from census. But because this is a very nomadic place with a lot of population movements, we opted to have a district-led enumeration to guide the planning. To ensure that eventually this is transitioned to program mode, we decided to use the essential medicine supply chain method. To also ensure sustainability and building capacity, we decided to use the community health workers whom we have, instead of using a project style drug distributors. We did cascade training. One group is empowered and then is rolled down. I've already said we have used community distributors. 5 cycles, as I said earlier, because of the fact that our rains are in that particular area are 5 months. The transmission season is covered in 5 months. We decided to use the existing pharmacovigilance systems to watch for any advanced events. And supervision was organized at the 3 levels. And most important, we decided to have our M&E built within DHIS2. All this will enable us in future to quickly transition to a program mode. Next slide. And in terms of feasibility, this is what we found out. In the 5 cycles, for example, you can see treatment coverage has been very, very high. In some cases, even over 100%. But as you have heard, there's migrations. And then there are neighboring communities who, because they got to learn about this program, in the second cycles, there have been some migrations. Next slide. We conducted also some household surveys to quickly check community perspectives in terms of awareness that SMC has been introduced in their area, if they know the purpose, why it is being done, if they are aware about the eligible age groups, how effective do they think the strategy is? But did their child who is eligible actually get it? So that we validate the data we collect with the surveys. Did the children complete the course? Did the VHTs actually do directly observed therapy in the first day? And then also now, evidence on because each of them is issued a card where all the information is written. How is the card retention? Are all doses received actually legibly well written on the card? Do the community health workers observe COVID SOPs? And you can see the results displayed, all above decision criteria. And so this showed to us some level of effectiveness and acceptability and understanding of and effectiveness of our implementation. Next slide. In terms of acceptability also, we found that there is a high level of SMC acceptability among communities, implementers, and policymakers. Personally, I went to the field a number of times. Apart from this study, I asked my own questions, and you can see very interesting quotes from the various people we checked. For example, a local leader saying the community is very grateful. They also rush whenever they hear about supply of sparkle. Honestly, the community has responded very well and they love the program. Now, this is a quote from a political leader, for example, that the district leadership looks at this program as being very helpful to the community in the fight against malaria. And that's why we are solely behind the program. And a caregiver also has said such, as you can see. Next slide. We went further to also do really non-randomized checks to see some breakthrough malaria in intervention areas and non-intervention areas. And you can see the numbers there. And the performance in intervention areas is really very encouraging. Next slide. This is really further talking about the same thing. You can see in intervention area, up to 90% of people have not had malaria, compared to only 15%. And breakthrough malaria in non-intervention area is very high, as you can see. Next slide. This is further representation of what we are seeing using now our routine data. As I said earlier, we designed various ways of monitoring this. Qualitative ways, asking from the community, from the leaders. We checked information in DHIS2. We collected also our own data, and also later on, some survey is also ongoing. And you can see the difference between intervention and control districts. Next slide. And this is the monitoring of breakthrough cases in the areas of implementation. Next slide. So these are really our key messages. We think SMC is feasible and coverage is similar to what is seen in the Sahel region. So answering really the question Dr. James Tibenderana talked about and the purpose of this meeting, checking whether SMC should really be limited to the Sahel or expanded as to other areas as an option for accelerating malaria reduction, and especially in area where vector control is challenged and chemoprevention is needed. We think this particular strata of Uganda is a possible area. It is acceptable by the population. Fortunately, this population has had mass drug administration-based interventions for a very long time. In the most recent, this is an area which is trachoma, which is fought through MDA. They have had leishmaniasis, onchocerciasis. So they were used to community treatment through medicines, and they are very well organized. The protective effect of SP is good. We still don't have full information on SP resistance, but it is being studied. And then as we are also working, and in the next phase, we would study further the impact of drug resistance on efficacy and allowing predictions on future effectiveness of SMC at preventing disease. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Opigo. As a reminder, we will take questions after the presentations. Please do submit your questions for Dr. Opigo in the chat, and I'm sure he will provide accurate and able answers. I would now like to invite the Director of the National Malaria Control Program in Mozambique, Dr. Baltazar Candrinho, where a similar implementation study was conducted earlier this year in Nampula province. He will talk about the results and compare them to what has been presented on the study in Uganda. And he will also give an overview of the design of the next phase of that study. Over to you, Dr. Candrinho.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. So I will present the result from all the experience in the results in Mozambique for the SMC, feasibility, acceptability, and the impact. Next slide, please. In last year, as a part of a midterm review in Mozambique, the NMCP decided to accelerate impacts, especially in high burden locations. So in that regard, we're recommending to use the different approach. So as a SMC, IPTI, or MDA. So particularly to explore SMC and the NMCP and the Malaria Consortium, we conducted the study in Nampula province because it's the first time. So it was very important to do as a study, to pilot, to see the results. So the implementation was divided into phases. Phase 1 conducted start last year from this year to this year. It focused on determining the acceptability and feasibility. And phase 2 started this year up to next year. It focused on the impacts. Next slide, please. Okay, let me say about the results for the phase 1. So SMC was implemented in Mozambique in 2 districts in Nampula province. Nampula province is located in the northern part of Mozambique. It's the most populated province, and also the incidence of malaria is very high among the country. So the target population was 75,000. It was a children 3 to 59 months. We conducted 4-month cycles of SMC between mid of November last year to February this year. So the drugs was PAC, SP and amodiaquine, was administered by the community distributors. These people was recruited and trained before the campaign. In phase 1, so we used the similar approach described by the Uganda in the previous presentation, but we had to conduct the experience in Mozambique, and we adapted also all materials to Portuguese, the official language in Mozambique, and adapted also to the Mozambique context. Next slide, please. Yes, so as similar to Uganda, so we found the SMC with SPAC safe, feasible, and acceptable in the local, especially here in the local context. As you may know, Mozambique is a part of SADC region. In this part of region, so this is the first time that one country implemented SMC. So the interventions appears to be high effective. So in non-randomized control trial, children who lived in districts where this SMC was conducted had 86% lower odds of developing clinical malaria during the peak season, if we compare with the districts, the control districts. So there were high rates of SP resistance, but one annual round of SMC does not appear to have had a negative impact on the resistance profile. Next slide, please. So this table shows the results for the drug resistance. So up to now, so we analyze the 50% of the samples. It's around the 600. In this sample, we found the similar results as the literature shows. So we didn't find a significant difference between before the interventions and the after intervention in terms of resistance. And we found also similar resistance in the markers K540E. Next slide. If we go for the pyrimethamine and amodiaquine, is the same results. So we didn't find we did find no markers of significance with respect to the EFCRT mutations. So recognize that there is some limitation use this polymer film for the PFMDR1 and PFCR as a markers. So these results suggest that amodiaquine is doing much of the work of prevention clinical disease among children receive SMC. Full adherence of 3 days PAC regime is therefore likely to be crucial to good effectiveness measure observed in this study, maybe a function of this high adherence of 3 days regime. Next slide, please. Next I will go for the phase 2. In this phase 2, as I spoke before, we focus on the impact. So this more work is needed to understand the efficacy of SPAC to clear existing infections and prevent new infections. This is what we mean by the term chemoprevention efficacy. To inform this policy change, more robust evidence of effectiveness in the form of randomized control trial is also needed. In addition, there is a need to better understand the changes over time in SP resistance in symptomatic malaria cases. Phase 2 will involve administration of a four monthly course of SPAC, is as similar as the phase 1, and to around 100,000 children in 4 districts. In this phase 2, we'll add 1 district. In phase 1, we had the 2 districts as an intervention and the 1 as control. And in this phase 2, we have a 2 intervention, 2 control. But particularly, we had the 1 district. In this district, we have some part of population with intervention and other part of population without intervention. Just what we are looking for is to see the impact of the intervention. Next slide, please. This is the study design for this phase. It's a you can see these are seven objectives. I will not go for all these 7 objectives, but in general, this study is designed as hybrid effectiveness implementation studies to determine the feasibility and effectiveness of innovative interventions, as well the chemoprevention efficacy of drug used. So we'll determine the effectiveness, the protective, to track the presence of change of SPAC and piperacillin resistance, determine the impact of SMC in Mozambique, map areas where the SMC could be suitable, prevention, further refine the SMC implementation, to understand the process, costing, and acceptability, and lastly, to inform the SMC policy in Mozambique. This is a crucial, is very important, because as the NMCP, we are still waiting for these results to introduce the SMC as a strategy in Mozambique. Next slide, please. This is just to show the study activities, the methods, and the measures. To show, you can see, we'll start with the end of round survey and the cluster randomized control trial, the protective cohort, the chemoprevention efficacy study, resistance marker study, you will not go for the modeling study, and lastly, the process evaluation. On the second column, you can see the sample size, and in the lastly, we can see the outcome measures. Next slide, please. Phase 2 field workers are started. We expected to have results in the mid of 2022. A paper describing the phase 2 protocol will be submitted for a journal publication. We are also preparing a paper that summarizes all phase 1 results. The phase 1 protocol and the detailed coverage results have already been published. You can see in these links. So just go and you will see the results. And we are actually in phase of approval to get approval for the ethical committee. As soon as we get the approval, so we'll start. They will expect to start on 14th of December. Next slide, please. I think that is all. Thank you. Muito obrigado for your attention.
Obrigado, Dr. Candrinho. We very much look forward to hearing about the results from phase 2 of this study once they're available next year. Please, again, remember, if you have questions for Dr. Candrinho, please put them in the chat. And likewise, I'm sure he'll be able to answer all the questions directed to him. I would now like to ask Craig Bonnington, a Senior Technical Advisor at Malaria Consortium, to offer some reflections on what the studies in Uganda and Mozambique can tell us about the potential scale-up of SMC, and what questions remain to be answered.
Thank you very much, James. So yeah, I would just like to sort of provide a few reflections on what we've heard from Dr. Candrinho and Dr. Opigo from Uganda and Mozambique, and sort of what that maybe means in the short term, long term, and thinking to the future. Here we go. So yeah, so what's interesting from both presentations is that we found that SMC was both safe, feasible, and acceptable. And we don't have the results currently from Uganda sort of regarding SP resistance, but we do know that 540E, a drug highly associated with sulfadoxine resistance, is quite prevalent in Uganda. And from the work that Dr. Candrinho has already presented, we can see that 540E is prevalent in Nampula, where SMC has taken place. But despite that, we do observe these good effectiveness measures, which is interesting because, you know, a couple of years ago that might not have been believed to be the case. And also, in addition to this, sort of over the cycles that we've had in Mozambique, although we do observe high levels of 540E, we're not seeing any great changes sort of over the number of cycles that we're providing. So when we think a little bit more about some of these results, particularly coming out of Mozambique, and what we're likely to find in Uganda and how this relates to SMC in East and Southern Africa in the future, I think it's important for us to remember that the WHO previously, you know, had said the recommendations had been that high levels of 540E were recommendations not to conduct SMC with SpAQ, so it's very interesting that with reasonably high levels of 540E, we are finding that we have a good effectiveness measure. So there is some work that has been done previously looking at associations of sulfadoxine, the DHPS markers, and their interactions, and how this is often associated with treatment failure using SP, for example. So this is a paper from Lucy O'Kell and her colleagues at Imperial and LSHTM from a couple of years ago, looking at an association between 540E and another DHPS marker, 581G. And there's a very strong association generally observed in East and Southern Africa, which is not the case you see in West Africa or Northeast Africa. So perhaps this information is sort of leading us to look a little bit more closely, not only at 540E, but other DHPS markers that might be associated with 540E that would give us a greater cause for concern. And we can already see in the Mozambique results that we do have one haplotype with 581G, but we need to look at the rest of the results to see if there is an association. But again, the point is there's very high SP resistance and we see a good effectiveness measure. Again, sort of, as Dr. Candrinho has mentioned, perhaps the case is that amidiaquin, particularly in Mozambique, is actually doing a huge amount of the work because we don't see PFCRT markers commonly associated with amidiaquin. And so understanding this sort of proportional ability of different drugs within SpAQ to clear and prevent existing infection will be very important moving forward in East and Southern Africa. So as part of this, something that we want to do a little bit more of, and thinking for Uganda and Mozambique, but even beyond, is whatever drugs are being used, we want to understand their ability not only to prevent infection, but their ability to clear existing infection, and understand whether current drug dosing regimens are sufficient to clear and prevent existing infection. and what role resistance plays in this. So the premise within SMC is that you're preventing new infections from taking place, but also the drugs should, for asymptomatic infection, be reaching therapeutic levels to clear existing infection. So we want to be able to understand this, because even if we have really good effectiveness measures, this sort of work where we look at chemoprevention efficacy will be able to inform us the drug's ability to prevent and clear existing infection, which will then give us a bit more information about how long we can expect these effectiveness measures to last for. And it could be because SP is involved in disrupting DNA replication of the parasites, and this is this diagram down here. Because it interferes with that, SP, even in high levels of drug resistance, may be good at preventing new existing infection, but not particularly good at clearing low-level asymptomatic infection. And so that's something that we really need to understand as we think about the possibility of scaling up SMC in areas with high levels of SP resistance. So thinking about that, we also want to think about exploring alternative drug regimens. So for example, for phase 2, in Uganda, there will be some work looking at dihydroartemisinin piperacin as an alternative SMC regimen, simply because we know that SP resistance is quite high, and there is probably, although we're still waiting on the results, a reasonably high level of amidaquine resistance. And so we want to think about, again, despite the effectiveness measures, how long could those effectiveness measures last for? And so while we explore that and try to understand a little bit better, we also want to explore alternative drug regimens. And then also something we're thinking about is how you could look at new areas within East and Southern Africa, but not necessarily have to do sort of large-scale studies that would last for 2 years. The information that we should be receiving from Uganda and Mozambique will be very informative in terms of how SMC can be implemented in these locations. But to conduct very long-term research across East and Southern Africa may be slightly difficult and costly. And so thinking about how you decide to expand to new geographies, we're also thinking a little bit about sort of rapid assessment tools and modeling that might be able to inform us as to where new appropriate SMC locations may be as we think about the possibility of expansion in East and Southern Africa. So thinking about the long-term implications as we move into new geographies. One thing that is increasingly important and has traditionally been less applicable to West Africa is thinking about how SPAQ administration at a large scale could impact other chemoprevention interventions using SP. So we really want to be in a position where we can use SPAQ for SMC and have good effectiveness measures, but at the same time, we also have to be very cognizant of the fact that this could affect IPTP in the long term. And so we need to make sure that we're also monitoring SP resistance among pregnant women moving forward, and also think about alternative drugs that could be used for SMC or indeed IPTP. The WHO many years ago had suggested the use of chloroquine, for example, for IPTP in areas with high SP resistance. And we may find in East and Southern Africa that's a very sensible approach moving forward, depending on what we find with SP drug resistance selection. The other thing to say is, as we think about alternative regimens to SP, including dihydroartemisinin piperacin, obviously this is an ACT, it's used as a curative drug, and particularly in Uganda, we know now that there is sort of nascent and novel K13 artemisinin resistance associated genotypes of falciparum in Uganda. And so any sort of wide-scale use of DP needs to be monitored quite closely, where you also want to be looking for plasmepsin 2 markers associated with piperaquine, MDR1 also with piperaquine, and then K13 markers to make sure that you're not imposing these selection pressures for resistance. The other thing to say is, so we're also thinking to the future about alternative drug regimens. So for immunoquinones, for example, chloroquine, piperaquine, amidaquine, have been proven to be very useful for SMC. And if we have high levels of SP resistance, if there are concerns over longer term use of ACTs for SMC, having novel combinations is something that we would like to explore a little bit more to see if we can have really good effectiveness measures and really good efficacy measures and effectiveness measures, and that those would be something that could last for a very long period of time in new geographies in East and Southern Africa. And obviously sort of the hot topic right now, perhaps that when we think a little bit more about some of the work in East and Southern Africa and maybe slightly different endemicity patterns, slightly different seasonality patterns, and where SMC may be a useful intervention. Vaccines and immunoglobulin are also things that perhaps could be interventions done in combination with SMC, and this would be a way around sort of a way around drug resistance in new geographies, but also perhaps able to deal with areas where you have a slightly longer season in SMC eligible areas that you would traditionally see in the Sahel. And then moving a little bit forward, we also need to think about climate change and how seasonality will change in a lot of these locations. This is also very applicable to West Africa, and thinking about whether seasons will get longer or shorter and how climate change may or may not affect transmission intensity in new locations. And also, this will necessarily have an impact over many years on the immunity of the population. So as we think about how transmission, climate change, and interventions may change immunity, we also need to think about how this, in the long term, could modulate the immunity of older children who are not SMC eligible, for example. So this is a very sort of long-term goal that we want to work towards to understand better, but it is a very important one. And then finally, we also think it's incredibly important to think a little bit more about SP resistance and drug efficacy in West Africa. We know, as you can see from this map here in the top right, that genetic diversity of SP, or rather sulfadoxine resistance is much higher in West Africa, meaning that you have lots of wild-type parasites. There may be some resistance, but the likelihood of resistance fixing in a population is much lower as you compare it to East and Southern Africa. However, SMC has been implemented at large scale across West Africa for a very long period of time, and so it is probably around the time that it's worth exploring this a little bit more and making sure that SPAQ is still functioning as well as it should do, and sort of make longer term predictions about SPAQ's utility in West Africa. So that's everything for me. The only final thing to say is, the results from phase 2 for both Uganda and Mozambique will be available next year. We plan to share results through more webinars, and we'll publish papers in peer-reviewed journals with all the information coming out of these studies. We're also engaging very closely with the SMC Alliance and having discussions about future research and perhaps what is a sensible way forward in East and Southern Africa and other geographies. And we also plan to engage with the SMC community about building further evidence across the board, not just in East and Southern Africa. And that's SMC by itself, but also SMC in combination with other interventions. Thank you.
Thank you, Craig. I can already see some questions in the chat. Please continue to sort of provide those questions. And thanks to all the presenters so far. I'll now like to hand over to Maria Rodriguez, Malaria Consortium's Mozambique Country Director, to facilitate the question and answer section. Over to you, Maria.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. James, and thank you, the presenters. To get us started, I will start by asking both panelists, what are the main lessons you have learned for implementing SMC to date? I mean, what do you see as the main facilitators, for example, in terms of your specific context or in terms of policies?
I go first? Okay. From my own observations, the most facilitating factor has been the choice to engage the leaders, work very closely with them so that we have a blessing of both district level and community level leaders. In terms of really not policy, but maybe tactical or operational level decision, the approach of trying to fit in existing systems, utilizing DHIs to database, utilizing existing community health workers, you know, those could be really the things facilitating, because then we didn't have to recruit new people. They have already been working, and then the systems were already in place. We are building on existing systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Opigo. Dr. Candrinho, over to you.
Okay, thank you. For Mozambique, the main lesson is the engagement of the community, the engagement of the leaders, local leaders, and the authorities of health and the Minister of Health. This is, I think, with this effort, we achieved these results, and there is no significant rumors in the field. I was a bit afraid about that. In this part of Mozambique, it's common to have some rumors, and sometimes things are not running well. But fortunately, so we did well with all these engagements. And the other, we are so a bit afraid about the SP resistance. And we found that even though with this SP resistance, so the result is quite good, and so excited with these results. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. So from your answers, it was very clear that the community engagement was key for the success for the implementation of the SMC in both countries. Thank you so much. So let me move to the second question, which is related to the cost and funding implications. So given the limited resources for malaria, will there be other intervention that you will need to scale down in order to implement the SMC in your countries?
Now, when we were designing our strategic plans, we were based on implementation packages. We looked at a set of interventions which, if put together, delivers the most impact. So the package in that place, there is already a decision on it. It is funded. But around the country, we had already also taken a decision that we need to focus on the most high burden places and accelerate them downwards. So in those particular places, what is needed is delivered. But yes, indeed, in some other areas, we have had to sift resources to where it is needed most, but in a package, because, you know, SMC or any other malaria intervention does not work alone. We need to benefit from the synergistic effect of deploying them all to scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Opigo. Dr. Candrinho?
Thank you for the costs. So in the place where we conducted the study in Nampula province is a big province in Mozambique in terms of size, population, in terms of, so this takes our study a bit expensive, but I think in the yes, to reduce the cost, especially for the human resource. I think we can engage more the community, the volunteers and community leaders to be involved on the study without many the payment, not without payment, but we can reduce the payment.
Thank you.
Maybe just to add on quickly, what we were thinking is, for example, during equipment months, whether we would need to do a lot of ICCM work. But we are still observing how many breakthrough cases will be there and whether they can be handled by the communities. This is something we are still observing. But the remaining 7 months of the year would need the ICCM service to take care of any infections which occur around that time. Although 60 to 70% of all malaria occurs around the season covered by SMC. So these are all being observed, and a decision will be made if we scale that down or run them concurrently. Thank you.
Thank you both. So my third question is related to the new RTS vaccine, to the implementation, to the SMC implementation. So will the impact of SMC be amplified by adding the vaccine on its implementation? So what are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I can start. Yeah, so we are not yet decided about the vaccine to be implemented in Mozambique, but of course we are so very interested to implement the vaccine here in Mozambique. As you may know, Mozambique is a part of high burden, high impact, and I think it makes sense that we have the vaccine in Mozambique to see the impact and to reduce the burden of malaria. So it's a great opportunity to have this SMC implemented in Mozambique. As we know that the SMC with the vaccine, the combination, so there is a synergies for the
similar to what Mozambique
opportunity to do in Mozambique. So I can see that just to go to great opportunities. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Candrinho. Go ahead, Dr. Opigo, please.
Okay, similar to what Mozambique has said, Uganda hopes to deploy the vaccine, considering the number of vaccines which will be available, the funding, and considering that it's likely to be rationed. We are already thinking of deploying it in the most high burdens regions of the country. And that happens to be also partly where we are doing SMC. We also know that the vaccine is supposed to work in a combination with other malaria interventions. And we know this will either synergistically amplify the effect. The second thing is we know the vaccine delivery at the moment is supposed to fit in the immunization program, but the immunization program at the moment goes up to 1 year. So the other 2 doses could best fit in community programs like SMC. And then we can also share data, because then we can have information about these children, how old they are, where they are staying. Also, the enumeration done for SMC can be used for vaccine estimates and mapping of where children and homes are. So there's potentially a lot of complementarity and working together, not only on impact, but the delivery mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we wrap up the questions and answer sections, I have 2 specific questions for each country. I will start by Mozambique. Dr. Candrinho, do you have any insight on how SMC outcomes will differ from the mass drug administration?
Yes, good question. And in Mozambique, we conducted the MDA in high burden area in Cabo Delgado last year. So it's been as a part of the study to see the impact of those 2 interventions. So the SMC and MDA. So this study is still in process. So I think in the future I can have an opportunity to present the results of the comparison of one and MDA and SMC. So we have the preliminary results. So we have seen the results, good results for the MDA. So we protected the people in that period that we administered the MDA. But as you know, fortnightly is a part of my study, and I'm so very interested to see the impact of all these chemoprevention intervention in Mozambique. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Candrinho. And the last question for Uganda is related to the child record cards. So the question is, why do you think only 75% of the caregivers completed the child record card? How can this be strengthened in the future?
We need to improve the training of the community health workers. The cards are actually completed by the community health workers when they move to the homes. We need also to sensitize the residents about safe custody of these cards. In some cases, actually, they were lost because you need it for subsequent cycles. So it really needs more training, more emphasis on the importance of the cards. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So that was my last question for the panelists. Over to you, Dr. James.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you to all the presenters for sharing their thoughts, results, and plans. And very importantly, thanks for all of you who spared your time to be with us on this webinar. I think what we have heard is that the results from the early stages of the research on the use of SMC outside the Sahel sub-region are promising, but also that more work is now happening to answer some of the outstanding questions that need to be explored before scale-up of SMC in those areas can be recommended. There are important discussions to be had over the coming months among the entire SMC community, and we will keep everyone informed about this work as it progresses. We hope this will be the first of a series of events to discuss the future of SMC. And again, I really like to thank the National Malaria Control Programs who have used a problem-solving approach to looking at SMC and the role that it plays in a comprehensive malaria program. For now, I would like to thank you all for your participation in this webinar. Our team will compile the main questions and answers, including those we did not have time to address today. And those will be shared in a follow-up email. We'll also make the recording available, and we'll be publishing a summary article about the webinar on the Malaria Consortium blog. Remember, we can also continue to converse. We can also continue the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #FutureOfSMC. Once we close this webinar, you will be redirected to a quick questionnaire. We would like to hear your views on the webinar, future topics you would like to know more about, and any other comments. The questionnaire will open automatically in your browser when this session comes to an end. We will now close this webinar. I wish everyone a productive day and look forward to continuing the discussion over the coming months. Thank you all. Stay safe. Bye.